events, you might want to know which button was clicked in this case and the message sent to the event. So what you can do is, if we dimension a local variable as a button and we set that equal to we convert the inbound sender, which in this case is the button, to a button instance of the button object, then we could do something like saying response.write and say the button clicked was and we would take button.id. Now if we fire up the page, click on any one of the buttons, let's click on this one, we're into the event handler, let it run from there, and you can see we get the message that is button 1. Let's do this one, let it run through. Button 3, let's do the left hand one, let it run, and that's button 2. So that gives you an indication on how you might deal with determining which button was clicked and then taking some action based upon that knowledge. So this shows us how the server control event handlers work in Visual Basic. Let's go over to our C# project and take a look at how that functions there, because it is slightly different. Let me close down the VB pages. Let's open up our default ASPX and the code behind in C#. Let's go and add a button. So there we have our button, and let's double click on it like we did in the VB. So you can see we get a button1_click method, and let's just change our message object to indicate we're in the button click event. So the question is, how is C# doing with the attachment of the event handler button1_click to the button click event? Because we don't have the handles on the method declaration like we do in Visual Basic. So what's happening is, if we go back over to default ASPX and go to the code behind, we'll see that it's using the approach of the onClick attribute and the name of the method. And then when the page is compiled, C# behind the scenes is automatically creating the event handler, or I should say the delegate to the event handler for the onClick event. Now we could do this explicitly ourselves, so let's take out the onClick in the declaration in the ASPX page, go back over to our code behind. Let me uncomment this on an it, and we'll just comment out that load handler, and we would do something very similar. So what we would do is we would say this.button1.click. We would add a new event handler, and in this case we'll map it to button1_click. And that's essentially what the compiler would be doing behind the scenes with our declarative syntax. So let's just fire this up and see that it works. Let me switch the startup project over to C#. We'll start it up, and we get our page with the button. Actually, we still have our event handler for page load, so we're hitting that. We'll just continue on. Click the button, down into the page load again, and we get the message change that we're in the button click event. So how do we handle the multiple controls mapping to the same event handler as we saw over in Visual Basic? Well, let me comment out this explicit event handler creation. Go back over to default ASPX, and let's put that on click back in, and that is equal to button1_click. So now let's add a couple more buttons to this page. Let's go back into the source, And so one approach, since we don't have the handles on the method over in the code behind, is actually to take this and we'd put this in all three of our button declarations. So now if we start up the page, we'll have our three buttons. Let me just put a breakpoint here on 31. Let me take it off of 27. Let it run. If we click on any of these buttons, you can see that we get here into the breakpoint inside the button one click event. Let it run. Click on the second one, we're in there, and also click on the far left, we're also in there. Now we could take the same approach here and explicitly declare the event handler, such as I did a few minutes ago up here in the on init. And in fact, we could put some of them in declarative syntax, some of them explicitly here in the code. And just quickly to point out how the design mode works, we saw before, very similar. What you'll see if we go to any of these buttons and view the events, that each of the buttons is set to button one click. So we could have come here in the design mode, gone to events, and selected the button one click for all of the controls on the page that you want to map to a specific event handler. So we've looked at how to map server controls to event handlers in C# and Visual Basic. One way is to put the attribute here in the declaration of the server control in the ASPX page. The other, depending upon the language, either in C# you can explicitly declare the event handler, or as we saw over in VB, if I open up that code behind, we can add the handles to the end of the method declaration. So all the events that we've been talking about here are server-side event handlers that are fired when the page posts back to the server. And there's one other aspect of this that I want to show you. Let me shut down the C# pages. And we'll open up the default ASPX for VB. Let me make website VB the startup project so we don't forget to do that. Let's go into the design mode and let's add a text box here on our page in addition to our buttons. Now the text box has a default event just like the button has a click event, so let me double click on the text box. We get the event handler in our code behind. You can see it's textbox1_text change. Has a handles out on the right saying it handles the text change. Let's do a response.write here. And we'll say in the text box. So let's fire up the page and see what happens. Get our page with the text box. Let me type some text in the text box. I'm going to hit tab to move focus to another control, and that should change the value of the text property, which it does, but our event is not firing. So let's go back and look at why we aren't getting the event firing. And this has to do with what I mentioned a few minutes ago, that these are all events that are fired based upon postback. And one of the things that had to be considered when they architected this system is that there are a number of events that occur in controls that are not, that they chose, I should say, to not automatically map back to posting, because obviously every time the page posts there's some overhead that's incurred. So what happens is that in the case of the text box, the events such as text change do not automatically initiate a post back, and there's a property on these server controls called auto post back, and in the case of the text box it is set to false. Now if we change it to true, what's going to happen is when the text is modified, I should say the text is modified and that fires the text changed event, which is the default event for the text box, it is going to post back to the server. So now let's start up this page and see what happens with the auto post back set to true. Let me set a breakpoint on line 20 in our text box 1 text change. Fire up. We'll type some text into the text box, and I will now hit Tab to move focus out of the text box, which should change the text and the text property. And indeed, it does post back to the server. Here we are in the event handler. We'll let that run through, and we get the response.write writing the in the text box to the page. Because of the overhead required in posting back to the server, you need to give careful consideration to which server controls have server-side event handling. This is Chris Pells. Thanks for watching this video on creating event handlers for ASP.NET page events as well as server-side controls.